Hey everyone, NecroVMX here, and it's time for another Urban Legends of Video Gaming. I got a great response to last week's episode where I talked about the Dragon Quest law, so thank all of you for your comments and suggestions. But before I move on to today's gaming myth, I should point out that there seems to be some confusion as to what does and does not constitute a gaming myth. Basically, if it's actually true, then it's not an urban legend. Though, if it's something that is generally greatly exaggerated, it can be, and I'll be covering a few of those, but when making suggestions, please try to keep it to things that aren't actually true. Anyway, today we're looking at a gaming myth that I've already debunked in my feature, The History of Final Fantasy, but it's worth mentioning again, especially for the people who didn't watch that feature. Since the first Final Fantasy game on the NES, or in Japan the Famicom, Squaresoft, the makers of the game, released the games on Nintendo consoles. And although the second and third games never came out in America, when it came time to release Final Fantasy IV, they moved on to Nintendo's next console, the Super NES, or Super Famicom. This may seem like a logical step, but keep in mind they did have a choice, as Sega's Genesis console, called the Mega Drive internationally, was out for quite some time before the Super NES, but Squaresoft waited around for Nintendo's next machine, and it paid off. When Final Fantasy VII was released for the Sony PlayStation, it threw a lot of people for a loop. The fact was, a lot of people naturally expected Final Fantasy VII to be released for Nintendo's next system, the Nintendo 64, as the first 6 games, as well as several spin-offs, were all on Nintendo consoles. It would be the first Final Fantasy game to be released on a non-Nintendo console, not counting ports such as the MSX2 version of the first game. Square had plans to release the game on the Nintendo 64, but decided the PlayStation was a better choice due to the CD-ROM media it used, as opposed to the cartridge format of the Nintendo 64. Well, that's all verified fact, and now the legend begins. The story goes that Square got development kits from the Nintendo 64 and started work on Final Fantasy VII for that console, and even created a demo of what the game's engine would look like. The demo, which has found its way online, mostly in the form of videos, features 3D polygon characters in battle with monsters. The demo was said to be from an early version of Final Fantasy VII for the Nintendo 64, or as some unimaginative people called it, Final Fantasy 64. The story continues that they worked with the Nintendo 64 hardware for some time and became increasingly dissatisfied with it and the limitations of cartridges, scrapped the project, and moved on to the PlayStation. The story is believable, especially that Square is quite open about the fact that they originally planned to make the game for the Nintendo 64, and that the swap to the PlayStation had a real fallout in the industry. Nintendo felt betrayed and threatened by the fact that Final Fantasy VII was selling so many of their competitors' consoles, and for the first time they were not number one. They retaliated in pretty much the most asinine way you could imagine, by claiming good riddance, and Square's games weren't very exciting anyway. No one wanted to play a game as slow and deliberate as Final Fantasy VII. People craved action, damn it. The bitterness on both sides, coupled with Square's relationship with Sony becoming quite lucrative, led to a long period of estrangement, not broken until many years later when Square started making games for Nintendo's Game Boy Advance and GameCube consoles. The main Final Fantasy series has yet to return to a Nintendo console, however various spin-offs and sequels have. But back to the legend. The mythic demo, Final Fantasy 64. The fact is, this story does not hold up to closer scrutiny. The most obvious thing being that the demo did not feature new characters, but rather characters from Final Fantasy VI. While some have erroneously claimed that this is because Final Fantasy VII was originally going to be a sequel to VI, that's also not true, as other aspects of the demo pull the story apart. Mainly the timing, as the demo was created before Square could have possibly had access to the Nintendo 64 hardware. They had not received any Nintendo 64 units or development kits at the time, and this demo was running on a much different platform, Windows. The fact is, they waited around hoping to make Final Fantasy for the Nintendo 64, but before dev kits were even set out, as soon as Nintendo announced the cartridge format, they started looking at the PlayStation. The truth behind the demo is that it's actually a fully playable game meant to demonstrate how RPG combat could be done on a PC using mouse movements to control the game. It was an interesting idea, but it didn't pan out into any sort of actual game. The characters from Final Fantasy VI are nothing more than placeholders, popular characters that people could identify with as they tried out something new. This demo has an actual official name, Final Fantasy SGI Demo, though it does go by some other names. Interestingly enough, one of them is Final Fantasy X. Not 10, but X, as in the letter. So that's another urban legend of video gaming debunked, but I'll give you a little more information just to show you that truth really is stranger than fiction, or at least more interesting. While it isn't true that Final Fantasy VII was in active development for the Nintendo 64, it was in fact at one time in open development for the Super NES, which would have made it the fourth Final Fantasy game on the console. The game was said to be somewhat similar to other later 16-bit Square RPGs, such as Treasure of the Rudras and Chrono Trigger, and featured a more realistic tone than the previous games, taking place in the then near future of 1999 in New York City. That's right, if history had gone slightly differently, you could have played a Final Fantasy game that took place in a futuristic Big Apple. Kind of makes Final Fantasy The Spirits Within look like it makes more sense, doesn't it? Anyway, join me next time and we'll talk about how sometimes, if you don't know the origin of a character's name, you could just make one up and people will believe it. NecroVMX, out.